I wasn't supposed to be there. That's the honest truth of it. I was covering a planning committee meeting 2 streets over drains, mostly, and a row about a car park nobody wanted when my editor rang and said the princess was coming to Wakefield Trinity and did I want it instead. I said yes before she finished the sentence. January in Wakefield does not care about your feelings. It was the kind of cold that gets into the gap between your collar and your jaw and just lives there. The sky was the color of old dishwater. Storm Chandra had been throwing rain at the north of England all morning like it had a personal grudge, and the ground outside the stadium was that specific shade of dark that means it was soaked through days ago and has simply accepted its fate. I got there early. Journalists always do, not because we're eager, well, some of us are, but because you learn pretty quickly that the interesting things happen before the official program starts. The moment nobody's managing yet. That window between setup and arrival when the real people are still being real. The community foundation staff were already outside when I arrived. 5 or 6 of them, huddled near the entrance in high-vis vests that did very little against the wind. One woman, 30s, sensible ponytail, the face of someone who has been awake since 5, was walking the path the princess would take, looking down at it with the kind of focused worry you only get when you've spent 3 weeks organizing something and the weather has decided to disrespect your efforts. Her name was Donna. She told me that later. She looked at the puddle forming near the side gate and said something under her breath that I didn't catch. Then, she looked up at the sky. Then, back at the puddle. We've got some of the In Touch group arriving at 7:30, she said to nobody in particular. Some of them haven't been out in weeks. Just, could we not have rain on top of everything else? It rained harder. The In Touch group. That's what I want to tell you about first, because before Catherine arrived, before the cameras and the security detail and the crisp energy of an official visit, this group was already here, and they were the reason for the whole thing. They came in 1s and 2s. A minibus dropped 4 of them at the gate, and a volunteer walked beside each one like they'd done this 100 times before, because they had. The group runs weekly. Quizzes, workshops, stadium tours. A warm room and a reason to get dressed. A man called Jeff, white hair, good posture, the careful walk of someone whose knees had opinions, made his way through the entrance like he owned the place. Which, in the way that matters, he did. He'd played for the club. Decades ago. He still wore a Trinity scarf, the red and white of it so old it had faded to the color of autumn. He sat down in the meeting room and accepted a cup of tea and looked around at the other regulars settling in, and something in his face went quiet in a way that was not sadness. More like the look of a man who knows exactly where he is and is glad of it. His friend Neil came in behind him. Former player too. They did the thing old friends do, not quite a nod, not quite a smile, just a shared recognition that the other one had made it today. Some weeks, not everyone does. I watched them arrange themselves around the tables. I thought about what Donna had said. Getting youngsters involved, but also how clubs like this connect to the rest of the community. She'd said it explaining the program to me, almost apologetically, like she knew it sounded like a press release and wanted me to know it wasn't. I believed her before I even saw the room. The teenagers arrived separately. A different energy entirely, louder, more performance in the body language, the self-consciousness of 14 worn like armor. They were from the Inspiring Futures program. At risk, the documentation said, which is one of those phrases that contains a whole life in 2 words and does very little to describe an actual person. One boy, I'll call him Marcus because I'm not using anyone's real name, sat with his arms crossed and his hood up despite being indoors. He had the particular look of someone who has been told this will be good for him by several adults and has decided to reserve judgment. I recognized that look. I wore it at 14. The workshop leader, young guy, used to read in the room immediately, said something to Marcus quietly, something I couldn't hear, and Marcus didn't exactly smile, but he uncrossed his arms. Small victory. The kind that doesn't get photographed. Outside, 2 security vehicles had appeared at the far end of the car park. Donna appeared in the doorway of the meeting room, caught my eye, and gave me the look that meant, she's close. I put my notebook away. I don't know why. I always have my notebook out. But something about the morning, the old men with their tea and their faded scarves, the teenage boy slowly uncrossing his arms, the rain coming down like it had a job to do, made me want to just watch for a minute. Just be there. Before it became an event. Here's what they don't tell you about royal visits. Nobody gasps. Nobody screams. There's no swelling music. The security come through first, professionals, unhurried, doing their quiet geometry of the room, and then there's a beat, a held breath, and then she's simply there. Present. Like someone who arrived not from a motorcade but from the nearest chair. That's the first thing that catches you off guard. The ordinariness of the entrance versus the complete unordinariness of the person. Catherine, Princess of Wales, walked through the door of Wakefield Trinity's community room at a few minutes past 11 on a Tuesday morning in January, in a navy coat and dark trousers, and she was not dressed for weather. She had just come from Bradford, where she'd spent the morning at a trauma therapy center, holding a shell to a little girl's ear so the girl could hear the ocean inside it. She had not changed her shoes. The hem of her trousers was damp. I noticed that before anything else. She looked around the room the way you do when you walk into a place and actually want to know what's in it. Not the polite scan of someone performing interest. The slow, real kind, taking in the tables, the scarf colors, the faces, the quiz sheets still laid out from earlier, the tea mugs. Taking inventory. Then, she smiled. And the room sort of exhaled. She went to Jeff first. Or maybe Jeff was simply where the room's gravity led her, I'm not entirely sure who directed whom. He stood when she approached, the old instinct of a man from a certain generation, and she said something to him I couldn't hear and he laughed. Not the polite laugh of someone in the presence of royalty. The real one that goes all the way to the eyes. He reached up and touched his Trinity scarf without seeming to realize he'd done it. They talked for a while about the club. About the old days and the current days and what the program had meant to him. He told her he'd been coming for over a year, that it had been his daughter who'd suggested it, that he hadn't wanted to at first. Stubborn, he said, with the absolute peace of a man who has made peace with his stubbornness. I think that's called resilience, Catherine said. He liked that. Neil was next. He was quieter than Jeff, more watchful, the kind of man who sizes up a conversation before he enters it. He told her about isolation. Not dramatically. In the flat, honest way of someone who's been through it and come out the other side and can describe it now without flinching. That the weeks blur. That the phone stops ringing eventually, not because people stopped caring but because life accelerates and you somehow don't. That the program had given him a reason to put his shoes on. Catherine sat with that for a second. Didn't rush to fill the air with comfort or affirmation. Just let what he'd said be what it was. Putting your shoes on, she said eventually, is bigger than people realize. Neil looked at his shoes. Laughed a little. Nodded. I wrote that down. She moved through the room with a quality I kept trying to name and couldn't quite. It wasn't the gracious efficiency of someone hitting marks on a schedule. It was more like she'd decided, somewhere between Bradford and here, that today was not going to be managed. That she was going to actually show up to it. She sat with the older group for the quiz segment, genuinely competitive, apparently, catching herself mid-celebration when her table got one right. A woman next to her, 70s, sharp as a knife, wore her hearing aid like a badge of honor, leaned over and said something in her ear, and Catherine covered her mouth with one hand and laughed the sort of laugh you can't plan. I saw the photographer catch it. That'll be the one that goes everywhere, I thought. I was right. Then, she crossed the room to where the teenagers were sitting. The energy shifted. Not badly, just the way a room shifts when different generations enter each other's orbit and nobody's sure of the protocol yet. Marcus still had his hood up. Technical. He was technically inside, technically in a warm room, technically participating. But the hood was still up. Catherine didn't make anything of it. She sat down across from him like she sat across from teenagers in school community rooms every day of her life, which, in fairness, she essentially does. She asked him about the program. About goal setting. About what he was good at. He said, after a pause long enough that a different adult might have redirected, football. Who do you support? She asked. He told her. She made a face, the exaggerated mock grimace of someone whose loyalties lie elsewhere, and he laughed. One genuine sound, surprised out of him. The hood came down. Not all the way. Halfway. Which was, in its own way, everything. She said it to the group before she left the room for the pitch. She'd been talking about the club, about the work the foundation did, about the league, and, she said, I love this, the league game is so embedded in community life. It's so grassroots. Getting youngsters involved but, also connecting to the rest of the community. Clubs like this are absolute gold dust. And, I'm so proud to be able to support the league. Gold dust. She meant it. You could tell from the way she said it, not a soundbite, not a prepared line, but a conclusion she'd arrived at herself over the course of 2 hours. The photographer was clicking. The communications team was communicating. The schedule was being kept, just about. But, the room had already happened. The real thing. The tea and, the scarf and, the laughter and, the hood coming down halfway. That had already happened. The cold outside was different from the cold inside. Inside you could almost pretend it was a room like any other room. Outside there was no pretending. The wind came across the pitch with the particular contempt of West Yorkshire January wind, and I pulled my collar up and thought about the drain meeting I'd abandoned and wondered if drains were warmer. They were not, probably. But, still. The girls were already on the pitch. Champion schools. The competition runs through schools across the north, gets hundreds of girls into rugby league who might never have considered it, who might have walked through their whole lives without once throwing a rugby ball with any intention. Some of them had been playing for months. Some of them, you could see, had been playing in their heads their whole lives and had only just been given a ball. They were doing drills when Catherine came out. Pass, move, pass. The rhythm of it. The coach, a woman with the unhurried authority of someone who doesn't need to raise her voice because she's never needed to call instructions, and the girls ran patterns and the ball moved between them in arcs that sometimes held and sometimes didn't. Cold breath. Wet grass. The sound of trainers on a surface that wasn't quite frozen but was thinking about it. Catherine stood at the edge of the pitch in her navy coat and dark trousers and held a rugby ball. She was, as has been noted, not dressed for sporting drills. Her shoes were not the shoes of someone who had planned to be standing on a rugby pitch in January in West Yorkshire in a storm. They were the shoes of someone who had planned to be standing on a rugby pitch in January in West Yorkshire in a storm and had decided to be there anyway. She held the ball with both hands, the way you hold something you respect but haven't fully committed to throwing yet. One of the girls, maybe 13, maybe 14, the age where you've decided you're too old to be impressed but your body hasn't agreed yet, looked over at Catherine and then, very deliberately looked away in the manner of someone demonstrating that they were not impressed. Then, she looked back. Couldn't help it. Catherine stepped onto the pitch. Not far. The communications people would not have permitted far, given the shoes and the schedule and the general principle that princesses do not faceplant on rugby pitches during official engagements. But, she moved into the space and took a breath of that cold air and something happened in her posture that I've been trying to describe accurately ever since. She became lighter. Not happier, exactly. She'd been warm and engaged all morning. But, this was different, the particular loosening of someone who has spent years in rooms where everything is managed, stepping into a space that cannot be managed. Where the ball goes where it goes. Where the ground does what grounds do. She bounced the ball once. Tested it. A girl jogged over and held out her hands and Catherine passed it to her, a real pass, not the performed gesture of an official visitor, but the actual intention of throwing something to someone who can catch it. The girl caught it. Seemed briefly surprised that she'd needed to actually catch it. Grinned. There was a question about Charlotte. There always is, the children are shorthand for connection, the way that asking about someone's family is the fastest route to the human underneath the title. One of the girls, brave or perhaps just curious in the way that 13 can be both simultaneously, asked if Princess Charlotte played rugby. Catherine laughed. She does loads of sport, she said, stamping her feet against the cold in a way that was entirely unself-conscious and very relatable, but not rugby. Pause. She looked at the girl. Then, at the pitch. Then, at the ball. Maybe I should bring her along sometime. The girl considered this proposition with the gravity it deserved. Yeah, she said. She should try it. Then, Catherine said the thing that I keep coming back to, that I've thought about more than anything else from that morning. She was talking to the group, loosely, about the sport, about why it matters, about contact being the point of it rather than something to be avoided, and, she said, there's not any other sport where you can say contact is a good thing. She said it lightly. Joking, almost. The kind of observation that's funny and true and doesn't demand anything from the people hearing it. But, I wrote it down. Because she'd spent the morning at a trauma therapy center, where she'd held a shell to a little girl's ear so the girl could hear something gentle and safe. Where she'd sat with children for whom contact meant something completely different, something that had needed months of gentle, patient work to become safe again. And now she was standing on a pitch in the cold, watching girls run at each other with joy, talking about contact being a good thing. Both things at once. All morning. That's what she'd been doing all morning. The girls did another drill. The ball moved. Someone dropped it and, the coach said nothing, just tilted her head, the most economic form of instruction, and, the girl picked it up and, ran again. Catherine watched from the edge. She still had one hand on the ball, not quite holding it, not quite letting it go. The way you hold something at the end of a day when you're not ready for it to be over. The wind picked up. A flag at the end of the pitch whipped hard. Nobody moved inside. Not yet. She left the way she arrived. Without a fanfare. One moment she was there and, then, the cars moved and, the high-vis vests relaxed and, the security geometry dissolved and, she was gone, heading somewhere else, probably already inside the next conversation. The rest of the day she went on to the Peak District. Hiked in the rain with mind over mountains, wearing proper gear this time, walking in storm tundra like it owed her nothing. But, I wasn't there for that part. I was still here. In Wakefield. On a Tuesday afternoon with cold hands and the particular stillness that follows something you weren't entirely prepared for. Donna was by the gate. She was holding a clipboard and staring at it with the expression of someone who has spent 6 weeks preparing for 2 hours and is now processing the aftermath. Not disappointed. Not relieved, exactly. Something more complicated, the quiet collapse of sustained attention, the way your shoulders drop when you finally let them. How do you think it went? I asked her. She thought about it honestly, which I appreciated. Neil talked about his daughter, she said. He never does that. In all the sessions, he's never mentioned his daughter. She looked at her clipboard. So? Yeah. The In Touch group were still inside. They'd gone back to the quiz. This happens, apparently, the visit ends, the cameras go, the official schedule moves on to the next engagement, and the group simply continues. Because the group is not for visits. The visit was for the group. I went back inside and stood near the door and watched Jeff lean forward over a question he was very confident about. He tapped the table twice with his knuckle, his tell. Apparently, I'd already picked it up and wrote something down and sat back with the self-satisfaction of a man who knows he's right. His team got it wrong anyway. He disputed this with considerable dignity. Neil laughed. A quiet, full sound. I found one of the Inspiring Futures coaches near the corridor, a man named Daniel who'd been running the program for 3 years. He was packing gear into a bag with the automatic ease of someone who packs gear every day. I asked him what today had meant for the young people. He kept packing. They're not going to go home and say, "The princess came and changed my life," he said. Not dismissively, just as a fact. That's not how it works. That's not what today was. What was it then? He stopped packing. Thought about it. It was someone who matters showing up. Not to inspect the program. Not to have her photo taken. But to actually ask. To sit with them and ask. He picked up the bag. Kids who've been written off notice when someone asks. He walked off down the corridor. I stood there for a second. Then, I wrote that down too. Marcus was in the lobby, waiting for the minibus back. Hood was down now. All the way. He was on his phone but, not compulsively, the kind of low-level phone use of someone who was comfortable in a space, not hiding inside a screen. I didn't approach him. He didn't know me and, it wasn't my place. But, a volunteer sat down next to him and asked if he'd enjoyed the session. He did the thing young people do, the minimal shrug that is designed to communicate indifference but somehow communicates the opposite. It was all right, he said. Which, at 14, in a coat with the hood down, in a place you didn't want to be 3 hours ago? That's everything. I went outside to get my car. The rain had stopped. Not dramatically, the sky was still gray, the ground still dark, the flags still hanging damp from their poles. But, the rain had stopped. You noticed it mainly because of the quiet. The absence of the thing that had been there all morning. I stood in the car park for a while. Here's what I kept turning over: she'd been sick. Seriously, quietly, privately sick. She'd gone through something in 2024 that she'd shared with the world in the most restrained and dignified way possible, and then, she'd come back. Not to applause, not to announcements, but to work. To the rooms. To the tea and the quiz and the cold pitch and the girl who looked away and then looked back. She'd said nature was her sanctuary through treatment. The outdoors. The ground under her feet. She'd walked in the rain today, later, on a hillside, in a storm, because apparently the storm was not sufficient reason to stay inside. I thought about Jeff touching his scarf. Neil talking about his daughter. The hood, halfway down. I thought about Catherine saying, putting your shoes on is bigger than people realize. I think she knows that from the inside now. I think it cost her something to know it. And, I think that's why, when she sat with Neil and he described the weeks blurring and the phone going quiet, she didn't rush to fill the silence. She'd lived in a version of that silence. She just didn't say so. The minibus pulled up. The In Touch group filed out, slowly, one by one, his scarves and coats and the careful walk of winter. Jeff went last. He stopped at the gate and looked back at the stadium. Not at where she'd stood. Just at the building. The familiar shape of it against the gray sky. Then, he walked to the minibus and got in. The driver pulled away. I got in my car and drove back to the office. My editor asked if it was a good story. I said yes. She asked how long. I said, as long as it needs to be. She sighed. That's always my answer. She knows that by now. I filed it the same evening. 4,000 words about a Tuesday in January. About an old man's faded scarf and a boy's hood coming halfway down and a princess standing on a wet pitch in the wrong shoes, holding a rugby ball like she wasn't ready for the morning to end. About the quiet thing in the middle of all of it, the thing nobody said aloud, that showing up, really showing up, with your shoes on, in the rain, in the room, in the cold, is not nothing. It is, in fact, the whole thing.